Chapter 4 of J.B. Bury's The Students' Roman Empire, Part 1. Recording by Philippa. The Students' Roman Empire, Part 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 4. The Family of Augustus and his plans to found a dynasty. While Augustus was constructing the new constitution, he had many tasks of other kinds, administrative, military, and diplomatic, to perform. He had to regulate the relations of the Roman state with neighbouring powers in the east. He had to secure the northern frontier of the empire on the Rhine and the Danube against the German barbarians, and to carry out there the work begun by Caesar his father. He had to improve the administration in Italy and Rome, and step in if the Senate of the empire failed to perform its duties. He had to reform the provincial administration which had been so disgracefully managed by the Senate of the Republic. Besides this, he had to make his own position safe by keeping his fellow citizens content. He had to see that the nobles and the people were provided with employment and amusement. Finally, he had to look forward into the future and take measures to ensure the permanence of the system which he had called into being. This last task of Augustus, his plans and his disappointments in the choice of a successor to his power, will form the subject of the present chapter. It is needful, first of all, to obtain a clear view of his family relationships. Augustus was married 3 times. 1. He had been betrothed to a daughter of Publius Servilius Isauricus, but political motives induced him to abandon this alliance and marry Clodia, daughter of Fulvia, in order to seal a reconciliation with her stepfather, Marcus Antonius. In consequence, however, of a quarrel with her mother, he put her away before the marriage was consummated. 2. His second wife was Scribonia, twice a widow, whom he also married for political reasons, namely in order to conciliate Sextus Pompeius, whose father-in-law, Scribonius Libo, was Scribonia's brother. By her 1 child was born to him in 39 B.C., unluckily a daughter, for had it been a son, much anxiety and sorrow might have been spared him. Her name was Julia. He divorced Scribonia in order to marry 3. Livia, the widow of Tiberius Claudius Nero, 38 B.C. Livia was herself a daughter of the Claudian house, for her father, Marcus Livius Drusus Claudianus, was, as his name shows, a Claudius adopted into the Livian gens. She was a beautiful and talented woman, whom he truly loved, and it was a sore disappointment to him that they had no children. Livia, however, brought her husband 2 stepsons, Tiberius Claudius Nero, born in 42 B.C., and Nero Claudius Drusus, born in 38 B.C., after her marriage with Augustus and suspected to be really his son. Besides his daughter Julia and his wife Livia, another woman possessed great influence with the emperor and played an important part in the affairs of the time. This was his sister, Octavia. She was married twice, first to Caius Claudius Marcellus, and secondly, for political reasons, to Marcus Antonius. By her first marriage she had a son, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, born 43 B.C., and a daughter, Marcella. It is necessary to say a word here about the political position of the emperor's kindred. The imperial house embraced the male and female descendants in male agnatic line from the founder of the dynasty, the wife of the emperor, and the wives of the male descendants. Thus Livia and Julia belonged to the house of Augustus, but Octavia did not belong to it, nor Julia's children until Augustus adopted them. The distinctive privilege possessed by members of the imperial house was that they were inviolable and sacrosanct, like the tribunes. This right dated from the triumviral period, and thus is explained how it was that Octavia, though not one of the imperial house, possessed tribunician sacrosanctity. She had acquired it not as the sister of Caesar, but as the wife of Antonius. Soon it became the custom for the soldiers to take an oath of fidelity to the whole house of the Caesars, but this custom hardly existed under Augustus himself. Under the first princeps, the members of his house enjoyed few honours and privileges compared with those which were acquired by them in later reigns. It has been already seen that constitutionally the emperor has no voice in appointing a successor to the Principate, for neither designation nor heredity was recognised. Augustus had to find a practical way for escaping this constitutional principle, and securing that the system which he founded should not come to an end on his own death, and that he should have a capable successor. The plan which he adopted was an institution which had no official name, but which was equivalent to a co-regency. He appointed a consort in the imperial power. There was no constitutional difficulty in this. The institution of collegial power was familiar to Roman law and Roman practice, and the two elements of imperial authority, the imperium and the tribunician power, could be held by more than one. But at the same time the consort was not the peer of the emperor. He could only be subsidiary. There could be only one princeps, only one Augustus. In fact, the consort held in relation to the Augustus somewhat the same position as the praetor held to the consul. Thus, from the necessity for making practical provision for the succession arose certain extraordinary magistracies, proconsular and tribunician offices, which held a middle place between the princeps on the one hand and the ordinary magistrates on the other. On the death of the princeps, the consort would have a practical, though not a legal, claim to be elected princeps, and nothing short of revolution would, as a rule, hinder him from obtaining the highest position in the state. The proconsular command was first conferred on the consort, the tribunician power subsequently. Under Augustus both powers were conferred for a limited number of years, but always for more than 1 year, which was the defined period for the ordinary magistracies. The consort had not command over the troops like the emperor, but it was common to assign him some special command. He did not bear the title of imperator, and he did not wear the laurel wreath. Nor was he included in the yearly vows which were offered up for the emperor. But he had the right to set up his statues, and his image appeared on coins. Anyone might be selected as consort, but it was only natural that the emperor should select his son for that position, and thus it became ultimately the recognised custom that the emperor's son should become his consort. By this means the danger of elevating a subject so near the imperial throne was avoided, and the natural leaning of a sovereign towards the foundation of a dynasty was satisfied. When the emperor had no children, he used to adopt into his family whomsoever he chose as his successor, and the danger of such a course was mitigated by the paternal power which he possessed over his adopted son. It was some time, however, before this usage became a stereotyped part of the imperial system. The first consort of Augustus was Agrippa, who married his niece Marcella. The proconsular imperium was conferred on Agrippa some time before 22 B.C., but Augustus had certainly no intention that Agrippa should be his successor. He was compelled to assign a distinguished position to his invaluable and ambitious coadjutor, to take him into a sort of partnership in order to secure his cheerful service. But circumstances brought it about that he came to be regarded, if not as the probable successor, yet as something very like it. As Livia proved unfruitful, Augustus had to look elsewhere for a successor. Within his own family 3 choices were open to him. Though he had no sons, he might at least have a grandson by the marriage of his daughter Julia, or he might select his sister's son as his heir and successor, or he might adopt his Claudian stepchildren. His first plan, the marriage of the young Marcellus with Julia, combined 2 of these courses. The empire might thus descend through a nephew to grandchildren. High hopes were formed of Marcellus, who was attractive and popular, and a great favourite of his uncle. The marriage was celebrated in 25 B.C., during the absence of Augustus in Spain, where he suffered from a severe illness, and Agrippa, the brother-in-law of the bridegroom, was called upon to act as the father of the bride. In the following year Marcellus was elected curial aedile, and a decree of the Senate allowed him to stand as candidate for the consulship 10 years before the legal age. At the same time Augustus allowed his stepson Tiberius to be elected quaestor, though he was even younger than Marcellus, and this perhaps was a concession to Livia, who may have felt jealous of the son of Octavia and the daughter of Scribonia. But there was another who certainly felt jealous of the favour shown to Marcellus, and regarded him as an unwelcome rival. This was Agrippa. He had entered, as we have seen, into affinity with the imperial family by his marriage with Marcella. He had been consul, as the emperor's colleague, for 2 successive years. If Augustus was the princeps, men were inclined to look upon Agrippa as the second citizen, and in the East, where political facts were often misrepresented, he was actually thought to be an equal co-regent with the emperor. He was not popular like his young brother-in-law, but he was universally respected. His services were recognised, and his abilities were esteemed, and he had every reason to cherish ambitious aspirations. Augustus had left Rome in 27 B.C. in order to devote his attention to the administration of Gaul and Spain. During his absence, which lasted until 24 B.C., there were no disturbances in Rome, although he left no formal representative to take his place. This tranquillity must have been partly due to the personal influence of Agrippa, who lived at Rome during these years, though not filling an official post. In 23 B.C., the year of his 11th consulate, Augustus was stricken down by another illness, and he seems to have entertained some idea of abdicating the imperial power. He summoned his colleague, the consul Piso, to his bedside, and gave him a document containing a list of the military forces and an account of the finances of the empire. This act of Augustus displays the constitutional principle that when the emperor died, the imperial power passed into the keeping of the Senate and the chief magistrates. But Augustus, although he could not appoint, could at least recommend a successor, and it is to his honour that he did not attempt to forward the interests of his family at the expense of the interests of the state. Marcellus was still very young, and his powers were unproved. Augustus gave his signet ring to Agrippa, thus making it clear whom he regarded as the one man in the empire capable of carrying on the work which he had begun. But Augustus was not to die yet. He was healed by the skill of the famous physician Antonius Musa. On his recovery he learnt that his illness had been the occasion of unfriendly collisions between Agrippa and Marcellus. While Marcellus naturally built hopes on his marriage with Julia, Agrippa was elated by the conspicuous mark of confidence which the emperor had shown in him at such a critical moment. Augustus therefore thought it wise to separate them, and he assigned to Agrippa an honourable mission to the eastern provinces of the empire, for the purpose of regulating important affairs in connection with Armenia. The proconsular imperium was probably conferred on him at this time. Agrippa went as far as Lesbos, but no further, and issued his orders from that island. His friends said that this course was due to his moderation. Others suspected that he was sulky, and it is clear that he understood the true meaning of his mission. But an unexpected and untoward event suddenly frustrated the plan which Augustus had made for succession, and removed the cause of the jealousy of Agrippa. Towards the end of the same year, Marcellus was attacked by malaria at Baiae, and the skill which cured his father-in-law did not avail for him. He was buried in the great mausoleum which Augustus had erected some years before in the Campus Martius, as a resting place for his family. The name of Marcellus was preserved in a splendid theatre which his uncle dedicated to his memory, but the lines in Virgil's Aeneid proved a more lasting monument. The story is told that Octavia fainted when she heard them recited, and that the poet received 10,000 sesterces, about £80, for each line. Augustus had now to form another plan, and it might be thought that the influence of Livia would have fixed his choice on one of her sons. But his hopes were bound up in Julia, and he now selected Agrippa as husband for the widow of Marcellus. The fact that Agrippa was married to her sister-in-law, Marcella, and had children by this marriage, was no obstacle in the eyes of the man who had so lightly divorced Scribonia. Agrippa had put away his first wife, Pomponia, to marry the niece of Augustus, and he was not likely to grumble now at having to sacrifice the niece for the sake of the daughter. Augustus set forth in 22 B.C. to visit the eastern provinces. He stayed during the winter in Sicily, and while he was there a sedition broke out in Rome, owing to a struggle between Quintus Lepidus and Marcus Silanus in their candidature for consulship. This incident seems to have determined Augustus to carry out his project of uniting Agrippa and Julia without delay. He recalled Agrippa from the east, caused the marriage to be celebrated, and consigned to him the administration of Rome and the west during his own absence in the east, early in 21 B.C. It is said that Maecenas advised his master that Agrippa had risen too high if he did not rise still higher, and that there were only two safe alternatives, his marriage with Julia or his death. In October 19 B.C. Augustus returned to Rome, and in the following year received a new grant of the consular imperium for 5 years. At the same time he caused the tribunician power to be conferred for 5 years on Agrippa, who was thus raised a step nearer the princeps. The marriage of Julia and Agrippa was fruitful. 2 sons and 2 daughters were born in the lifetime of Agrippa, and another son after his death. In 17 B.C. Augustus adopted Gaius and Lucius, his grandsons, into the family of Caesar, and it seems clear that he regarded Gaius and Lucius Caesar as his successors, and their father Agrippa as no more than their guardian. But if so, it was necessary to strengthen the guardian's hands, and when Agrippa's tribunician power lapsed, it was renewed for another 5 years. But Augustus was destined to survive his second son-in-law, as he had survived his first. Agrippa died in Campania in 12 B.C. at the age of 51, and was laid like Marcellus in the mausoleum of Augustus. The emperor's sister Octavia died in the following year. The death of the consort did not interfere with the plan for the succession, but he was a great loss to Augustus, whose weak health rendered him unequal to bearing the burden of the empire alone. The tender age of Gaius and Lucius Caesar required a protector in case anything should happen to their grandfather before they had reached man's estate. Augustus accordingly united his elder stepson Tiberius with Julia, 11 B.C., and thus constituted him the natural protector of the 2 young Caesars. For this purpose Tiberius was obliged, much against his will, to divorce his wife, Vipsania Agrippina, by whom he had a son named Drusus. This Agrippina was the daughter of Agrippa by his first wife Pomponia, daughter of Pomponius Atticus, the friend of Cicero. Thus Tiberius put away Agrippa's daughter in order to marry his widow. No statesman perhaps has ever gone further than Augustus in carrying out a cold-blooded method of uniting and divorcing for the sake of dynastic calculations. His younger stepson Drusus had been likewise drawn closer to the imperial family by a marriage with Antonia, daughter of Octavia and niece of the emperor. Tiberius and Drusus had already performed important public services and gained great military distinction by the subjugation of Rhaetia and Vindelicia, 15 B.C. In 12 B.C. and the following years they had again opportunity for displaying their unusual abilities, Tiberius in reducing rebellious tribes in Pannonia, and Drusus in warfare with the Germans beyond the Rhine. The death of Drusus in 9 B.C. was a great blow to Augustus, who had really paternal feelings for him, but never cared for Tiberius. But he could hardly have found a more capable helper in the administration than his elder stepson. Tiberius was grave and reserved in manner, cautious and discreet from his earliest years, indisposed to conciliate friendship, and compelled to dissemble by the circumstances in which he was placed. But he was an excellent man of business, and as a general he was trusted by the soldiers and always led them to victory. He became consul in 13 B.C. at the age of 29. Augustus raised him to the same position to which he had raised Agrippa. He granted him the proconsular imperium first, about 9 B.C., and 3 years later the tribunician power. In this policy he was doubtless influenced not only by the merits of Tiberius, but by the influence of Livia, to whom he granted the jus trium liberorum in 9 B.C. On receiving the tribunician power, Tiberius was charged with a special commission to the east, to suppress a revolt which had broken out in Armenia. He had doubtless hoped that his stepfather would adopt him, but he saw that he was destined by Augustus to be the guardian of the future emperors rather than a future emperor himself, that he was consort indeed of the princeps, but was not intended to be the successor. He was too proud to relish this postponement to his stepchildren, and instead of undertaking the commission, he retired into exile at Rhodes. In the following year Gaius Caesar assumed the toga virilis. He also became a consul designate. 4 years later he received the proconsular imperium and a special commission to Armenia. 1 A.D. was the year of his consulship. The succession now seemed safe. Lucius Caesar had assumed the gown of manhood in 2 B.C., so that the Julian dynasty had 2 pillars. The Roman knights had proclaimed Gaius and Lucius principes iuventutis, an honour which seemed to mark them out as destined to become principes in a higher sense. From this time forward the title princeps iuventutis came to be formally equivalent to a designation of a successor to the principate who was still too young to enter the Senate. But fortune was adverse to the plans of Augustus. Lucius died at Massilia in 2 A.D., and 2 years later Gaius received a wound at the siege of Artagira and died in Lycia, 4 A.D. Thus the hopes which Augustus had cherished during the past 20 years fell to the ground. But the death of his grandchildren was not the only misfortune which befell Augustus. The depravity of his daughter was an even more grievous blow. The licentious excesses of Julia were the talk of the city, and were known to all before they reached the ears of her father. She had long been unfaithful to her husband Tiberius, and his retirement to Rhodes, though mainly a manifestation of antagonism between the stepson and the grandsons of the emperor, may have been partly due to his estrangement from her. But at length her profligacy became so open that it could no longer be hidden from the emperor. She is even said to have traversed the streets by night in riotous company, and her orgies were performed in the forum or on the rostra. In short, to quote the words of a contemporary, "In lust and luxury she omitted no deed of shame that a woman could do or suffer, and she measured the greatness of her fortune by the licence it afforded for sin." The wrath of Augustus, when he learned the conduct of his daughter, knew no bounds. He formally communicated to the Senate an account of her acts. He banished her to the barren island of Pandateria, off the coast of Campania, 2 B.C., whither her mother Scribonia voluntarily attended her, and no intercession on the part of the people induced him to forgive her. Her lovers, Claudiae, Scipiones, Semproniae, and Quinctii, were exiled. But one of them, Julius Antonius, son of Marcus Antonius and Fulvia, whom Augustus had spared after Actium and always treated with kindness, was put to death, on the charge that he had corrupted the daughter in order to conspire against the father. Rumour said that Livia, scheming in the interests of herself and Tiberius, had a hand in bringing about the misfortunes which fell upon the family of Augustus, but there is no evidence whatever that such was the case. The other children of Julia and Agrippa could not replace Gaius and Lucius. Agrippa Posthumus showed such a bad and froward disposition that Augustus could build few hopes on him. The younger Julia proved a profligate, like her mother. There remained Agrippina, who had married within the imperial family, and did not disgrace it. Drusus, the brother of Tiberius, had wedded the younger Antonia, daughter of Octavia and Marcus Antonius. Of this marriage Germanicus was born, and Augustus selected him as a husband for Agrippina. The emperor thus united his grandnephew with his granddaughter, as he had before united his nephew with his daughter. In deciding the question of the succession, Augustus was obliged to have recourse to Tiberius, yet not so as to exclude Germanicus, or even to deprive the young Agrippa of all hopes. After the banishment of Julia, Tiberius had wished, but had not been permitted, to return to Rome. He is said to have spent his time at Rhodes in the study of astrology. In 2 A.D. he was at length permitted to leave his place of exile, and during the 2 following years he lived at Rome in retirement, until, in consequence of the death of Gaius, he was called upon to take part again in public life. On June the 27th, 4 A.D., Augustus adopted both Tiberius and Agrippa Postumus, and caused the tribunician power to be conferred for 10 years on Tiberius, who was sent forthwith to conduct a campaign in Germany. At the same time Tiberius was required to adopt his nephew Germanicus. As for Agrippa, he soon ceased to be a possible rival. His conduct was such that Augustus was obliged to banish him to the island of Planasia. Thus, after the frustration of many plans, Augustus was in the end compelled to recognise as his son and heir the aspirant whom he liked least, but who was perhaps fitter than any of the others to wield the power. When he adopted Tiberius, he expressed his feelings in the words, "Hoc Republicae causa facio," I do this for the sake of the Republic. 9 years later, 13 A.D., Tiberius was raised higher than any previous consort. It was enacted by a special law, lex, introduced by the consuls, that he should have proconsular power in all the provinces and over all the armies, co-ordinate with the proconsular power of his father, and that he should hold a census in conjunction with Augustus. It is significant that the proconsular power was conferred by a law. In all previous cases Augustus had bestowed it by virtue of his own proconsular imperium, but now the power of Tiberius in the provinces is no longer secondary, but is co-ordinate with and limits that of Augustus himself, and does not expire with the death of Augustus. It is therefore conferred by a lex. At the same time Tiberius received a renewal of the tribunician power, no longer for a limited period, but for life, and the Senate selected him to hold the foremost place in the senatorial committee, which, at the request of Augustus, had been appointed to represent the whole Senate. End of chapter 4.